Welcome back, children. Another day with an absent but not quite absent Mr. Lassard. I have taken the time to put together a special presentation for you, a second special presentation for you today. This one's going to be a bit longer than the one that you had yesterday. Yesterday was just kind of some information and then some work time. Today is going to be some notes. The nice thing about this presentation is that you get to take the notes in class and not as a homework assignment. Since we're done reading Things Fall Apart, this was going to be homework. Since I have to be absent, I turned it into a class assignment. So let's get started, shall we? We have some goals today. We can see over here on the right, we've got Calvin and Hobbes is looking at a map, and that's going to be kind of our guiding metaphor for what we're taking notes on today. Our goals are for you to be able to understand the role of a strong thesis statement in academic writing, and also for you to be able to write an acceptable thesis statement for your upcoming literary analysis paper, which I talked to you about yesterday. Now, I know that thesis statements are something that we have been coming back to over and over and over this year. We've talked about claims and thesis and statements and things like that. But for this particular paper, there's some really specific things that I need you to accomplish in that thesis statement, which is why we are going to talk about them once again. You will be accomplishing these goals by looking at example thesis statements and taking notes on thesis statements, and then making an attempt at writing a thesis statement for your paper. So something to remember about thesis statements is something that we have come back to over and over and over again over the course of the year, and that is the thesis as a map. I've drawn lots of little stick figures on the board with roads and maps to, sometimes it's a map to nowhere, sometimes it's a windy map to somewhere, sometimes it's just a nice little map to a destination. And what I would like you to remember is that a good thesis or claim is like a map that tells you where you're going and how you'll get there. And it's going to be really, really important that you do the best that you can do on writing a good thesis for this literary analysis paper, which I keep telling you is coming closer and closer. So at this point, you should pause the video and set up some Cornell notes in your notebook for thesis statements. So we're going to look at three examples. The first two are going to be acceptable examples of thesis statements. What I'll do is I will show you the thesis statement, I'll show you what it's doing, and I'll kind of tie it back to this checklist that's over here on the left. So here's some things that you should probably write down as notes and about what good thesis statements will do. They will clarify how a topic will be explored. So they'll kind of give us the topic and tell us, like, this is what we're going to do with this topic. They will imply what will be learned about the topic. So again, remember, a thesis tells us where we're going to end up. By the end of this paper, you will learn this thing about this topic. They give a map for where we're going and how we'll get there. That should be, at this point, ingrained in your head. A good thesis statement is only 1 to maximum 2 sentences long for the type of paper that you're writing. And they always appear at the end of the introduction paragraph. Now, if I've done my job, you already knew most of this stuff. But the tricky thing is being able to actually do it. It's one thing, you've heard me say this so many times, but it's one thing to know something, it's another thing to be able to do that thing. So I'm going to show you 3 examples. I highly suggest that you write the 3 examples down as part of your notes. At the bare minimum, you should be taking notes on the other things that you notice or learn throughout this presentation. So here's example number 1. It says, by looking at Okonkwo's background with his father, then at how he raises his own sons, readers will be able to see him as a deeply flawed but ultimately sympathetic character. So that's our thesis statement for this imaginary paper that it might be in. And of course, it's 1 sentence long, as the second to last bullet point says, and it would appear at the end of the introduction paragraph for this paper. So let's look at a few things that this thesis is doing. Number one, it clarifies our topic, right? So that's the first bullet point over there on the left. Clarify how the topic will be explored. The topic, if we read carefully, we can tell is Okonkwo's father-son relationships, right? Or father-son relationships in general, but focusing around Okonkwo. And that's one of the areas of inquiry that we've been looking at throughout this book. It also tells us what we'll learn, which is the second bullet point over there on the left. So it says, what we'll learn is that Okonkwo is flawed but sympathetic. Now, we can see that. I mean, like it's stated right there for us in the thesis, right? It's not proved for us. The thesis is just telling us what we are going to learn once we've read the entire paper, or what the writer is going to prove to us with their use of evidence and their elaboration upon that evidence. But this thesis statement also tells us a couple of other things. It tells us basically how the paper is going to be broken down into 3 parts. I'm going to label those parts as body paragraphs, but I want you to know that it might be that it would be better to think about these as parts. Like sometimes it's multiple body paragraphs for each of these. I'm just going to call them body paragraph 1, body paragraph 2, and body paragraph 3. So if we look at this thesis, we can tell that body paragraph 1 is going to be about Okonkwo's relationship with Unoka, because that's the first thing that shows up in the thesis, right? By looking at Okonkwo's background with his father, so that's Unoka, right? That's the first thing that you got to write about in the paper. Body paragraph 2 is going to be about Okonkwo's relationship with Nwoye and Ikemefuna. Now, it doesn't clarify in the thesis that it's going to be Nwoye and Ikemefuna, but we can safely say, having read the book, that that would make a lot of sense, because the second part of the thesis says, then we're going to look at how he raises his own sons. Well, we've got Nwoye's the biological son. Ikemefuna is the adopted son. Those would be 2 good sections, or two good characters to look at. And then the third thing, the third body paragraph, is going to be how Okonkwo's flawed relationships make him sympathetic. And we can see that in the last part of the thesis, where it says readers will be able to see him as a deeply flawed but ultimately sympathetic character. So this is a good thesis. It's not a great thesis. It's going to lead to a fairly straightforward and not too difficult to follow paper. If we follow the thesis, and if we follow the map that the thesis has laid out for us, we're going to do a pretty good job with the paper. All right, as long as we provide ample evidence and elaborate on that evidence and all that stuff. All right, let's look at a second example. So the second example says this: the range of Okonkwo's sacrifices in the book show that it is possible to see him as either a protagonist or an antagonist, but either way, the audience can sympathize with his decisions. Now again, it's a 1-sentence statement that lays out a map for us. That's the second to the last check mark, right? We also know that, of course, it would be at the end of the introduction paragraph. All right, it's the last thing we would read before we got into the body paragraphs. So let's look again at what is this thesis doing. It's laying out the topic for us. It's clarifying the topic, which is the first check mark over there. This time it's acts of sacrifice. We can see that right there at the beginning, right? That's one of the areas of inquiry that we were looking at throughout the book. So that's easy enough to see. It even says the word sacrifice right there in the thesis. It's telling us what we're going to learn. We're going to learn that Okonkwo is both heroic and villainous, but always sympathetic. So that's a little bit more complex than the last one, but it's still provable. We can see that in the thesis statement. It says it's possible to see him as either a protagonist or an antagonist, so I've just kind of switched up the wording there. And then, of course, it's laying out a map for us. It's saying, this is the order that I will prove these things to you, so that by the end you will learn this thing. So again, I'm going to lay it out as body paragraphs. Just be aware that sometimes it takes multiple body paragraphs. Just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to pretend that each of these is just going to be one body paragraph. So body paragraph 1, would be that sacrifices show he's protagonistic. So you would look at sacrifices, provide information about sacrifices that show Okonkwo as a protagonist in the story. All right? Straightforward enough. You just provide that evidence, you elaborate on how it shows he's a protagonist. Body paragraph 2 is going to be sacrifices that show he's an antagonist, right? And it should make sense. I mean, we look at the thesis and it says either a protagonist, so that's part 1, or an antagonist, that's part 2. So in body paragraph 2, we look at sacrifices that show him being antagonistic toward other characters in the story. All right? We don't want to do it. We don't want to flip those two things around unless we also flip them in the thesis. Lastly, the last thing that will be covered, body paragraph 3, will be all about how all of his sacrifices show, sorry, that's a typo, make Okonkwo a sympathetic character. So despite the fact that sometimes he's protagonistic and other times he's antagonistic, he's always sympathetic. And so then you'd have to provide evidence and elaboration on how, despite these two kind of conflicting ideas, he's a sympathetic character. And by the way, sympathetic characters, that was the first discussion that we had for the book. So we can go through this checklist. Has it clarified our topic? Yes, we know that it's going to be about sacrifice. Does it imply what we're going to learn about the topic? Yes. Okonkwo is both heroic and villainous, but always sympathetic. Does it give us a map for where we're going and how we'll get there? Yes, we can see what body paragraph 1, body paragraph 2, and body paragraph 3 will be about. We're going to look at one more example. So this is a more complex example. I'll just show it to you and then we'll go through it. So it says, by comparing and contrasting Igbo and Christian views on femininity and masculinity, readers will notice that it is difficult to paint either culture as truly right or wrong, forcing the audience to grapple with whether either culture is truly civilized. Now, there's a lot in this thesis. This would end up being a much larger paper than the last two thesis statements. It would also, if done well, end up being an A paper. Whereas the other two thesis statements, if done well, probably would struggle to get really up to that A grade. So is it one sentence long? Yes, it's one sentence long. It could probably be split into two and it would still be an acceptable thesis. And it would appear at the end of the introduction paragraph. So that should be clear to us at this point. Now, what topic are we covering? Well, gender roles. If we look, we can kind of narrow it down to femininity and masculinity. We're going to be looking at how Igbo and Christian cultures are similar and different in terms of femininity and masculinity. So our topic is gender roles. We know that because that's the area of inquiry that we've been looking at throughout the book. What are we going to learn about the topic? Well, we're going to learn that Igbo culture and Christianity both struggle with the idea of being and acting civilized. So this is where it gets complicated because we are going to be looking at what it means to be and act civilized through the lens of femininity and masculinity, or through the lens of gender roles. And that's a harder idea to grasp than the last two. And that's what would make it an A. All right, because you're basically taking it through several steps before you get to this idea of being civilized. It's definitely not an impossible thing to prove. It's just a more difficult thing to prove. So how are we going to learn this? What's the roadmap that's going to take us through this complicated idea? And you're going to see that this is a little bit trickier. Again, this is something where I'm going to say multiple paragraphs, body paragraph 1, body paragraph 2, body paragraph 3, but each of those body paragraphs, really, if we did a good job, would probably end up being a couple of body paragraphs. And I know that's a little confusing, but I'm sure that you can pick up on what I'm doing here. So I'm going to say body paragraph 1 would be about comparing and contrasting Igbo and Christian views on gender roles, because that's the first thing the thesis tells us to do. Compare and contrast how the Igbo and the Christian people go about treating gender roles. The second body paragraph then is going to be about exploring how each culture has virtues and weaknesses in their approaches. So once we've compared and contrasted the similarities and differences, then we have to kind of go into some details about, okay, each one has strengths and weaknesses to their approaches. And the similarities and differences are then going to bounce off of each other. And again, this is where it's getting a little complicated. This is something that would take a lot of brain power to actually manage in a good way without letting the paper devolve into something that's confusing. So, I apologize for those of you who are having trouble kind of following along with how this one might be accomplished, but I just wanted to give you a more complex example. The final part of the paper then, the topic of body paragraph 3 would be about exploring how audiences must grapple with whether either culture is civilized or not. All right. So notice that one of the other things about this one is there's the compare and contrast part, and then the two separate parts are just about exploring. It's about showing that I can see this from multiple points of view, right? Rather than it's not as straightforward as the previous two that you have seen. And this would lead to a really, if done well, a really good paper that would be really thought-provoking to your reader, which is a good thing. All right, so that was a lot to get through, and I know that was a lot, and congratulations for bearing with me. We are almost done. Here's a couple of friendly reminders about what we're going to do with this information. Remember that you guys are going to be writing a literary analysis paper on one of the 3 areas of inquiry and things fall apart, and we covered a lot of that through just going through these thesis statements. Here's the prompt. Analyze how the depiction of blank shapes the meaning of the book as a whole. Look especially at how colonialism affects the meaning that surrounds your area of inquiry. I think I suggested yesterday that you write it down. If you didn't, here it is again. It wouldn't be a bad idea to write it down. Remember that discussions and quizzes and readings, especially if you read with Mr. Ramsey, doing annotations and double entry journals, which now you need 3 of, those are all things that should have helped prepare you to write this paper. And the more you put into doing those things, the more you're going to be able to do in your paper. If you didn't put a lot of effort into doing those things, then the paper is probably going to end up being kind of simplistic. Because if you put a bunch of effort into it, you may be able to write that really good kind of solid, more complex paper that we're going for an A. In the future, remember that on my website there are additional paper writing resources that go into more depth, not just on thesis statements. There's a video on CEEC essays. So how do you put those essays together? How do you use a claim, which would be your thesis? How do you provide evidence and elaborate upon evidence, which of course you're also working on in your double entry journals? And how do you conclude? There's also a specific video that just talks about introductions and conclusions, like how to write a good, strong introduction and conclusion. So those are both videos that you can go back and watch on your own time. Some of you have already watched and taken notes on them, and that's great. But at this point, if you haven't, it would probably be a good idea.
Marianne Allen, if you're in the building, please dial 7010. Marianne Allen, thank you.
That's really annoying, and I'm sorry. Anyway, it would be a good idea for you to go and take a look at those videos. They will really, really help you in writing this paper. So if there is time remaining in class, and I don't know if there is or not, you may have been pausing this video and taking notes, and I don't know how much time is left. But if there's time remaining, here's what you should do. Work on finishing your double entry journals. One for chapter 1 through 6, another for chapters 7 through 13, and another for chapters 14 through 25. And once you're done with them, then you need to use them. They're there so that you can start putting your paper together. You look for patterns. And once you see the patterns in your double entry journals, that's when you start saying, oh, okay, it looks like my thought process is leading me to this idea. And then you can write a good thesis. All right. So that's going to be really helpful. What double entry journals will be really helpful for is just kind of figuring out what you will be able to prove in your paper. And then also, if there's time remaining, work on writing a thesis for your paper. Look for those patterns and then try your hand at writing a thesis. We are also going to have some discussions. I will be back, believe it or not, and we are going to have those discussions, and those discussions might also help you with writing a thesis statement. I just want to say this, if we're staring down time left in class, whether it's 5 minutes or 15, it is not acceptable for you not to use your time in class. I do not want to come back to notes about how you decided, well, it's okay, Mr. Lassard's not here, so we're not going to work on these things that are on the board. So, without anything further, I applaud you for getting through this, and I look forward to seeing you soon.